So the Federal Reserve cut interest rates last week. You've probably heard about that by now. Not really a surprise. They've been signaling that this is coming ever since they stopped raising rates right around this time last year. So no surprise there. What was a little bit surprising was the size of the rate cut. Typically, the Fed cuts interest rates, or raises for that matter, in small increments, usually about 25 basis points or 1/4% at a time. Now, this time around, they cut interest rates by 0.5% or 50 basis points. Now, usually a bigger move like that is indicative of something big happening in the markets that requires a big jump in interest rates almost immediately. And almost certainly the Fed is going to continue cutting rates because that's what they're signaling. So, unless there's some kind of a departure or a massive turnaround in the economic metrics that they're looking at, we're supposed to probably expect interest rates to continue coming down. Now, what was even more surprising than the 50 basis point cut that the Fed made last week was the amount of people that have completely unprompted, out of the blue, out of nowhere, said to me that this was a political move. Now, it is a little bit suspicious, right? It's happening right before an election, and the size of the cut is larger than we typically expect. What I found interesting, though, was that the half dozen or so people that brought this up to me unprompted could not agree on which presidential candidate this 50 basis point rate cut was supposed to benefit. Now, we do have a situation where we're in kind of like a Schrodinger's incumbent type election, right? You've got two kind of incumbents, but two also not really incumbents. Kamala Harris is obviously the VP currently, so it would be an incumbent administration, even though she'd be in a different role. Former President Trump trying to be now future President Trump. He's an incumbent in that he was a president, but wasn't the last president. So you've got that kind of odd dynamic. So the half dozen or so people that brought this topic up to me couldn't necessarily even agree on who the 50 basis point rate cut would benefit if the rate cut indeed was political. Now, here's the thing. The Fed officially is a non-political, non-partisan organization, okay? The timing might raise eyebrows, that's fine, but if it's apolitical and, outside of the scope of politics, then they're going to occasionally make changes that are in line with various, political calendar items. So I'm not really too concerned about that. The 50 basis points, as opposed to the typical 25 cut, suggests to me that they're seeing weakness in the economy that, may not necessarily be obvious to a lot of people just by looking at the headline numbers. Now, the headline numbers being things like inflation rate and unemployment rate. And I bring those two up because the Fed has what's called a dual mandate. That means they're responsible for doing two things at once. Now, unfortunately, these two things are somewhat contradictory to one another. Let's look at the two items. So the first is they want to maintain what's called full employment. Now, full employment does not necessarily mean zero unemployment. Right now, the unemployment rate is about 4.2% as of last check, which historically is still pretty low. We've had lower, but 4.2% is not a bad unemployment rate. And inflation, on the other hand, is 2.53%. Now, somebody in the comments is obviously going to say, well, there's problems, Mike, with the way that they calculate these things. I understand, I know, but we're going off of, what's available from the federal government. So we kind of have to take what's available. Once we start adding additional things into the calculation, you have a tough time comparing things over time and a tough time remembering what you added in, what you didn't add in, and at what point do you stop making adjustments to the rate. So we're just going with the official numbers, understanding that there are issues both with the way unemployment and inflation are calculated. So the Fed has a dual mandate, right? Maintain full employment and also maintain stable prices, that being the other side of that coin. Now, stable prices to the Fed does not mean that the prices never change. In fact, the Fed wants inflation. They just want a measured dose of inflation, and their target for that is 2%. So they're okay with prices going up steadily, but as long as they do so in a measured and predictable manner. What we've had over the last 3-4 years with inflation is not measured, nor is it predictable. It's big jumps in inflation. You're looking at things going up 5, 7, 15, 20%. That's not what the Fed wants. Now, we're not at necessarily full employment, but we're pretty close, right? And we're not necessarily at our inflation target, but we're pretty close, even though we're still north of it. Keep in mind that 2.53% inflation number that has been reported by the government most recently is still north of 2%, and it's 2.53% inflation over and above the already inflated prices that we've seen over the last few years. So I think if you were to poll, 100, 1,000, 10,000 average Americans and say, what do you think is more important? The unemployment rate currently or the inflation rate currently? And I think most people would probably say, I'm more worried about inflation than I am unemployment. Inflation impacts everybody, including the unemployed. Unemployment really only directly impacts those without a job, and that's about 4.2% of people currently. So, with all of that said, the Fed's got these two mandates that are somewhat contradictory to one another. If interest rates go up, it likely means that employment numbers or unemployment is going to also go up, okay? When money is harder to come by and it's more expensive, it's more difficult for companies to grow and expand. And by growing and expanding, you typically need to hire more people. So higher rates, while they're great for combating inflation, higher interest rates keep inflation down, but higher interest rates also make unemployment go down. Whereas if you have the inverse, if interest rates go down, you'll actually risk increasing inflation, but you're likely to get less unemployment or more people into the workforce. So that's kind of where we stand right now. Obviously, the Fed thinks that unemployment and a weakening economy is a bigger concern than what we're seeing with potential inflation coming back. And that's not to say that inflation is done for or it's a solved problem. It might bounce back. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if it did with the lower interest rates, especially if the Fed continues to do what they're signaling that they're going to do, is continue cutting interest rates. So with that said, there's not a lot of agreement as to who this 50 basis point rate cut, as far as a presidential candidate, would benefit. But you should also consider whether or not a 50 basis point rate cut in general is going to be good for the economy. Now, it certainly benefits some people, right? If you're planning on making a big purchase that's going to be somewhat financed by debt, whether it's a big car loan, cars are expensive now, or a mortgage, houses are also expensive right now, you'd rather have 0.5% lower rates than you would 0.5% higher rates. It might mean you might finally be able to afford that house that you couldn't at a higher mortgage rate, or you might be able to get into a slightly nicer house in a better neighborhood for about the same amount of money. Who it hurts, on the other hand, is people that are not consumers, savers, right? If you've got money in a savings account, a CD, a money market, any kind of fixed type product, you're likely to see lower returns because those interest rates that are going to be paid on those are going to be lower. And they're going to continue to drop if and when the rates continue getting cut by the Fed. Now, with all that said, why did the Fed cut rates and why did they make the cut as large as they did and as quickly as they did? Well, I don't think it's a political move necessarily. And the reason I don't think it's a political move is neither candidate has come out and said, oh, look at what I got the Fed to do, or I'm working for you because the Fed is cutting rates. If there were behind the scenes things like that going on, and I'm not saying there aren't, because who knows what really goes on in back rooms in DC, right? But if either candidate could convince the American people that they had a hand in the Fed cutting interest rates and that this was a good thing for them, they would certainly come out and try and take credit for it, directly or indirectly. And neither candidate has really done that. I think the bigger issue is we've got a problem with the budget in this country. If you ran your household budget the way that the US government is running their budget, you would be broke, you would have a terrible credit score, and you would be bankrupt in no time flat. Let's look at some numbers. So the US national debt right now is about $35.5 trillion, give or take a half a trillion. The numbers are changing very quickly. You can check them out yourself at usdebtclock, DEBT clock.org, O-R-G. Numbers are updated in real time. That $35.5 trillion in debt that we have equates to about $104,000 per citizen. So every man, woman, child, non-binary individual in this country, $104,000 is what that comes out to. Now, if you're looking only at taxpayers, knowing that not everybody is a net taxpayer, there's stay-at-home parents, there's children, there's the elderly, you're looking at $269,000 per taxpayer. That's a crap ton of debt that we have. And that debt is becoming more and more difficult to manage. It's becoming a greater and greater portion of our economy. To break it down into numbers, it would be the equivalent of you earning $50,000 a year and spending $70,000 a year. And that extra, that $20,000 difference, putting it on a credit card. So every year or every month going forward from there, you're paying off a very large chunk of your take-home pay is going towards paying off that credit card. Now, that's not stopping you from overspending by an additional $20,000 the following year, and the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. You see where I'm going with this? The only difference between you and the government is they can print more money or issue more debt, whereas you can't. Well, I guess you can print more money, but I don't recommend it because you'll be getting a call from Secret Service. Now, with that said, what are we spending all of this money on? Well, I'm glad you asked. The top budget items are Medicare and Medicaid, which accounts for about $1.8 trillion. Social Security, which accounts for about $1.5 trillion. And then the third item, and this might be a surprise to a lot of you, is actually interest on the debt that we have accumulated, and that's $951 billion, roughly, give or take a few bill here and there. Now, with that said, we actually spend more money on servicing our debt interest every single year than we do on the military, because military defense wars, that entire budget is $928 billion, so about 25 billion less than we spend on interest. So the real beneficiary here is neither the Democrats nor the Republicans or Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. The real beneficiary is the government system as a whole, because having lower interest rates allows them to continue to kick that can down the road just a little bit further than they would be allowed to if interest rates were higher. They can spend just a little bit more than they otherwise would, and that's just enough for it not to be their problem, but to be their successor's problem. It's enough to get us from 5 years down the road to 6 or however long, right? And this is a problem that currently has no end. Neither presidential candidate has a solution for it. High debt levels aren't necessarily bad as long as you can kind of grow the economy and continue to expand and service that debt. But the debt portion is already massive. Just the interest alone is our third largest line item, and it's problematic. So to answer the question that we started out this video with, was the Fed's move political? I don't think so. I don't think they're really working with either party or either candidate to encourage people to vote for them or I don't think they have a preference necessarily. I think the issue here is much bigger than either political party. It's the fact that the United States has a big spending problem. Interest on the debt is becoming an ever larger component of our overall budget. And in order to try and get that under control, what the Fed can do is cut interest rates so that the United States can continue to issue additional debt, but at lower rates. Now, it does mean that there's a potential problem, right? If I'm buying United States debt, or any debt for that matter, from a company or an individual or whoever, right, that's already deeply indebted, there's a greater and greater chance that they're not going to be able to pay that back the more in debt that they get. And I'm not going to be willing to accept a 3% return, but I might be willing to accept a 4 or 4.5% return. Just pulling numbers out of a hat here. So you get the idea. There comes a point where the United States might not be able to meet all of their obligations because they're spending so much money on so much dumb stuff, and nobody wants to buy the debt at the interest rates that they're being offered at. Now that's a problem that has yet to pop up, but it could become a major issue. My understanding is there are already some entities that have cut back or stopped buying U.S. debt, and I expect that to continue and probably get worse the lower interest rates go. But theoretically, the lower interest rates go, if there were no change in the actual demand for that debt, then you'd be able, if you're the government, to continue spending recklessly for a longer period of time than you would otherwise. So there you go. I don't think it's a political move, but I think it is a pro government spending move. And I think that's probably an issue. Maybe not right now, but it will be if it continues indefinitely. That's all I got to say for today. If you've got questions, comments, concerns, you can hit me up. My email is in the description, or leave a note in the comment section below. If you want to see more videos like this, me talking about the economy or investments in general, subscribe to my channel. I'll try and put something out on a regular basis going forward, particularly as things heat up in the election season and candidate programs and policies will absolutely affect your bottom line going forward. So if you're interested in that stuff, hit the subscribe button, and I'll talk to you soon.